comparing vintage lenses to modern lenses. Now, when I say vintage, we're going to be looking at like older style lenses, the characters, the sharpness. Then also we're going to be comparing them to modern day photography lenses, such as the 35 1.2, which I am shooting on with right now for photography, which is known as a photography lens, but you know, by all means, you can use it for videography as well. We are going to be comparing it against the FD35F 2.0 concave lens. Now, I just want to go over a few pros and cons of when we are going to be comparing a vintage lens to a modern lens. Yes, there are going to be some advantages of using a modern lens or a photography lens over vintage lenses, but also there's going to be advantages of using vintage lenses over photography lenses. Now, the advantage from the Sigma over the concave 35mm, the Sigma is going to be an f1.2 aperture, so we're going to get more light coming into the sensor, as to where the concave 35 is an f2.0. But now sometimes we might not look at how shallow depth of a field we can get when we use these modern day lenses. It kind of also really matters of what kind of look we are aiming towards to get. Now, most of these vintage lenses or rehouse lenses, you don't really find a very low f-stop like a 1.2. They're more so going to be like an f2.0 or t2.0 or even like a t1.5. But in this case, it depends on the situation of what we're shooting. The 35 1.2 is going to have a lot more advantages over the 35 concave lens. But like I said, it depends on the situation. It depends on the atmosphere. If we're shooting in low light situation like we are right now, I would rather shoot on the 35 1.2 just because we can get more light in. And as of right now, I am shooting at a 1.2, but you can barely tell that I'm at a 1.2 only because, you know, it's very flat. It's just a wall. There's no depth of field behind me. So in this case, it doesn't even matter of what lens we're shooting in. But if we're also shooting product stuff or fitness stuff or commercial and you want that very shallow depth of field, that's where the 1.2 is going to shine, especially with having that big depth of field. But if we're going for something with more modern, or if we're going for more of a vintage characteristic look, something that flares good, I would highly recommend using a vintage lens, or a vintage lens will be chosen over the modern lens. Now, one of the other advantages of using vintage lenses over modern lenses, vintage lenses are going to be a lot smaller than modern photography lenses. Now, the only thing is that vintage lenses might be a little heavier. It depends on what vintage lens we're using. In this situation, the concave 35 f2.0, it's got some weight to it. I don't think it is as heavy as a 35 1.2. The 1.2 is actually a lot bigger than the 35 f2.0. But now where the 35 1.2 will shine as well is if we're doing gimbal stuff, or if we're a one-man band and we need that autofocus. Obviously, these vintage lenses don't have autofocus, so everything's going to be direct manual when you're focusing. But like I said, it all depends on the project we are shooting. It all depends on what look we're going for. It all depends on what the end goal of the production or video commercial is going for as well. Now, this is the Super Multi-Coated Tachomer 55 1.4. Very vintage, very characteristic. I was also going for a very minimalist rig. That's why I decided to use a Super Multi-Coated Tachomer. If you are within a budget, I would highly recommend picking up a Super Multi-Coated Tachomer. And I've also used this as my taking lens when I've been using the Kawa 16H anamorphic lenses. Because it just adds an overall characteristic to that scope. Majority of this video, I kind of just want to base it around lenses that I have right now on me, which would be the Sigma 35 1.2 and the Canon FD Concave 35 f2.0. I've noticed so far that on the vintage FD lens here, that the colors are a lot more warmer and yellowish as to compare to the, let's say, if we're comparing it against the Sigma 35 1.2, it's a lot more neutral and cooler. And obviously this lens is going to make our image a lot more sharper. We do not want to get this digital look that are coming out of these cameras, because it can kind of give us too much of a sharpening look to the image without us even doing anything. So that's why majority people add a vintage lens in front of the sensor, because it kind of overall softens and creates like a super bloomy look over the sensor, which you know, in the end goal, I think majority of us here are trying to go for the film look, which if you've noticed on films, you know, the image doesn't look very sharp, but it's clear and it's also soft as well. And that's why I think majority people use vintage lenses, because it's just going to give us that overall more organic film look. Here are a few samples of using the Sigma 35 1.2 versus the Canon FD 35 f 2.0 concave lens.